Hello, Game Masters. I am Andy, the CEO of We Geek Together and the head writer for Relics of War, this gaming packet. If you are a player, get out of here. This is for Game Masters only, and I will be walking you through the packet so you can run this game easier. Relics of War is a 5th edition compatible adventure for party members level 5 and for a party size of 3 to 6 players. You can modify these to fit your group or your campaign however you need to. The adventure is this: your party needs to go and find some forgotten relics of a past war. The previous Dead Wars, in fact, when angels and demons fought on a battlefield, they left important, powerful artifacts on this wasteland, and the players need to go scavenge those artifacts and bring them back to their faction. There are 5 factions for your party to choose from. There is a video of the different faction breakdowns along with their lores and their powers. On the front page, there's a brief summary of it as well, but refer to the very back of the packet for full in-depth faction breakdowns. We are starting on page 3. This has a brief summary of the adventure, and I broke it down in very easy bite-sized chunks. In the Game Mastery Summary section, you see a breakdown of how this adventure should work. There's a start to the adventure. The party will need to travel. Then they will arrive at the Wastelands. At the Wastelands, they need to search for magical artifacts, and then they will encounter an opposing faction. After encountering the opposing faction, there will be a hidden boss revealed and a boss fight, and then the conclusion of the adventure. On this front page, it has a lot of key information that you need to know at a glance. So, before you can even play this adventure, your players need to choose a faction that they want to support. Make sure to go through the different factions with the players and answer any questions. These factions are definitely playtest material. They have not been fully tested and worked out. In fact, you guys are the sorry guinea pigs of this experiment because we are going to be using these factions in the final game. There will be a way that you can leave feedback and advice for these factions in the reporting section. Your players will play through this adventure. At the end of the adventure, you will need to report on the results of this adventure. And there is a main objective that your players know and a secret objective that your players don't know. The main objective is faction oriented. Different factions have different objectives. For example, if your players are playing the Protectors faction, they need to purify any of the remaining demon glass. However, the Arcane Registry is trying to capture and study the demon glass. So, on page 4, you will see the main objective write-up that will choose the different factions' objectives. Depending on what your players choose, that's their main objective. Right under it, you see the secret objective. This is an objective you, the Dungeon Master, will hide from your players, and you don't tell them what it's about. The real thing we want to see is how do your players interact with an opposing faction. If there's a different faction on the Wastelands, do they fight them? Do they decide to become allies with them? Do they compromise with them? We really want the players to choose how the factions are going to interact and if there's going to be allies or enemies on the battlefield. This is a great way that they can shape this world. So keep this secret objective, but take note of how your players interact. So we have the main objective, and we have the secret objective. Then you have, still on page 4, the adventure start. Now, I wrote a different start for every single faction. There's a different Protectors start. There's a different Arcane Registry start. This is mostly flavor. It sets them in the world, in their faction, interacting with key members of that faction. This is a great way to add flavor and get your players invested in the Dead Wars setting. Each faction has their own unique setting. However, the mission is pretty much the same. get to the wastelands and then either collect or destroy a certain artifact. Every section has, not only does it have the NPC, but it also has a brief description of the extra information that NPC will know. It also talks about payment and also talks about any special things that your faction will have access to. So, our players now know their main objective, and they've met with an important NPC to give them the quest. Now they must travel. Traveling for each faction is unique. Some of the factions have access to teleportation. Some of the factions have access to tree walking. Some of the factions have horses and carriages. Once they use their main mode of transportation, they then must travel for 3 days on foot. On page 7, you'll find a travel chart. Roll a d8 and narrate the results. Some of the results are good, some of the results are neutral, and some of the results are bad. Then on page 7, your players will arrive at the wastelands. We have provided maps for your players and a very special Dungeon Master only map. On this map, we have a location for where the players are going to enter. We have hotspots where the different relics can be found, and then we have a space where the opposing faction will enter. We even have recommendations on where to spawn the enemy boss. So, your players arrive at the wastelands and they must now search for relics. The wastelands have been abandoned for years. Nature has reclaimed a lot of this area. So your players will have to turn over wreckages and rubble and even dig a little bit to find these relics. They will have to roll skill checks to find the relics, and they have to be careful about accidentally touching demon glass. Demon glass is a very volatile object. If touched with bare hands, it will cause damage to your players. This is common knowledge by the NPCs who should know about this, and players will have to make skill saves when they accidentally come into contact with demon glass. After a few searches, an opposing faction will appear. They have a similar mission, but an opposing mission. So, when your players choose a faction, look at the other factions and find out what faction will best come into conflict with your players. If your player's mission is to retrieve the demon glass relics, choose a faction that is trying to destroy the demon glass, or they themselves want the demon glass. There are 5 different factions, so they each have their own main objectives. Choose one with an opposing objective. Then your players will get to have a round of diplomacy where they get to talk and interact with the opposing faction. I created this very simple mechanic. You will use D6s to mark how the opposing faction is feeling about your players. You will start at 1 for ally, and you'll start at 1 for an enemy. So there's a handout where you place a D6 face side up with a 1 on both sides. As your players make successful persuasion or deception checks, as they appeal to the common good, as they try to negotiate, give them points on the ally die. Tick that dice up, trying to get to 6. However, every time they fail a check, every time they talk poorly about the enemy or the opposing faction, anytime they do something that hurts the relationship, tick up the dice for enemy. Whichever dice gets to 6 first will change the results of how the factions interact. If this dice comes to 6 on the ally side, the opposing faction will work with the players. They will compromise and they will listen to the players. If the opposing faction turns 6 on the enemy die, then the opposing faction will become hostile and will try to recover the artifacts that they can by force. This will, of course, start initiative combat. All right, so we have the opposing faction. They will either be in combat or they will be in collaboration with the players. The opposing faction will then accidentally release the secret boss of this adventure, the Corrupted Angel. They will accidentally set free from a contained gem prison this corrupted angel. And the corrupted angel will enter the battlefield and start wrecking chaos. The corrupted angel has a very beefy stat block, so let's talk about combat for a bit. This can be overwhelming if you are trying to balance both an opposing faction and the corrupted angel, but don't worry, we have built in simple mechanics to make combat easy for dungeon masters. I know your pain, so I have tried to make this as easy as possible. The opposing faction has a very simple stat block. They have one melee attack and they have two ranged options. Just choose one action per opposing faction member. They're pretty easy to kill. And then once per round, you can give them one of their faction abilities. Use the faction breakout sheets that we've provided at the back of the packet. But the opposing faction should be able to fold pretty easily and have very simple tasks. The enemy boss, the corrupted angel, is a very beefy, very high damaging target. The idea is to play it chaotically. This corrupted angel doesn't really understand where it is. It can't even really think straight, as it's both angel and corrupted demon in one poor soul. And so it will attack wildly without tactics. It can't use cover. It can't focus down an enemy. But its attacks are pretty dangerous. It has multi-attack, where it can shoot rays of divine energy, and it has a corrupted sweep, where a black tentacle will come and swipe anybody nearby. It also has a reaction that anyone who hurts it, it will automatically react and harm whoever hurt it once per round. It is a pretty simple stat block. Just remember, it's got multi-attacks and one reaction, and its whole goal is to just spread out damage constantly. The nice thing about having an opposing faction is that gives your players somewhat of a buffer room. You can target the opposing faction and start killing them off before you really focus on your players. You can also use the opposing faction as an ally for the players, and have the players give them commands and ideas if using an opposing faction is too much for you. The players can control the opposing faction. I want to be clear, for the players, they should manage their own faction powers. Every faction has a handout like this that explains the rules and the mechanics for their faction. You are to give this to your player, and they will track their powers, and they will use this in combat. You, as the dungeon master, should not be micromanaging this for them. This is for the players, not for you. That should alleviate a lot of the stress. These faction powers are also really broken. They allow the players to do a lot more during their turn, and to feel powerful and like they're working together as a team, which is really cool. But that's why we've buffed up the Corrupted Angel stat block so much. Now, you will have to fine-tune its attacks and its HP to make a much more cinematic and approachable adventure, depending on your player's skill level and how much they actually use that packet. Again, the opposing faction is a good buffer because you can target and kill the opposing faction before you start hurting your players. After they've defeated the Corrupted Angel, the opposing faction will part ways peacefully. They will not try to attack the players again, even if at the beginning they were in conflict. They will lick their wounds and retreat. The players are then able to collect whatever resources they need left and travel back to their base and finish the quest, receiving the reward that they were promised. Now, let's talk about reporting. We will, in the packet, provide a link and a QR code that you can scan. Once you scan that code or follow that link, it will take you to a website where you can report your team name and you can report the outcome of the secret objective for your players. We are only collecting information on the secret objective, which is which faction did your players play as, and then which faction was the opposing faction. The other piece of information we want is, did the players work peacefully, or did they come into combat with the opposing faction? Did they annihilate the opposing faction? So there's three things you're reporting on. What faction did your players play? What faction was the opposing faction? And what was the outcome of the diplomacy? Did they work peacefully? Did they start combat? Or was the opposing faction wiped out? This will shape the Dead Wars and shape the alliances between the factions. If your players and other groups are allying with and working with other factions, that will start things off on a good term with other factions and give us chances for these factions to work together. However, if it's very combative, well, that's also really cool because now we have a lot of tension in the world as the different factions are butting heads and fighting against each other. All the resources in this packet should be provided to run the adventure. Hopefully you won't need too many more outside resources. The maps are both black and white in color, easy to print, or you can use them digitally. We'll have two options to give feedback. On our store Discord will be a great place for you and your players to interact with other people in the adventure. There will be a Dungeon Master only chat that you can join where you can ask me and other Dungeon Masters any questions you have about this adventure. You can also give us any feedback on the adventure, anything you might think might need to be tweaked or rules need to be changed. Again, this is very much playtest beta material that we will then use in the final game of the Dead Wars. These faction powers are not nailed down and will still take a lot of tweaking and working to do. So I appreciate the help. Also, on the reporting online website where you will report the results, there will also be a Google form that you can fill out on how it was for your faction. Lastly, I love game stores and I love supporting local game stores. We are sending out press kits to local game stores here in Utah, and we're trying to work with other game stores around the world. If you have the opportunity to play this adventure in a game store, that would be amazing. Game stores love having other players in, and it's a great way to support your local game store and find a good place for you and your players to meet. So, if that opportunity is available for you, absolutely give it a try. Thank you for joining us for the Dead Wars. I'm really excited to start this adventure off with you guys. And the Dungeon Masters, you guys are really the glue that's making this all possible. We've been very fortunate in our previous games to have over 200 Dungeon Masters working side by side with us. And sometimes it feels like a thankless job, but I can't tell you how much we appreciate all the work you guys put into making this game awesome for your players. We couldn't do it without you. Literally, there's no way we could do it without our Dungeon Masters. So thank you.